It was a quiet evening when everything I thought I knew about my life came crashing down. What would you do if the person you trusted most betrayed you in the worst way imaginable? Stick around and let me take you through the night that changed my life forever. The smell of rain lingered in the air as I pulled into my driveway earlier than expected. My training exercise had been canceled last minute, something that never happened. I was eager to surprise Natalie, my wife of 6 years. In our quiet suburban neighborhood near the base, coming home unannounced felt like the romantic gesture we'd both been craving. At least, that's what I told myself. I'd spent months overseas, entrenched in routines that revolved around duty and discipline. Natalie often joked that I was more married to my job than to her, but I'd always believed she understood the sacrifices that came with loving a soldier. Tonight, I was determined to make her feel seen, loved, and appreciated. I had even stopped at her favorite bakery to grab those macarons she adored, but rarely treated herself to. As I approached the house, something felt off. The lights in the living room were dimmed, but the faint flicker of the TV glowed through the curtains. Usually, Natalie would be lounging on the couch with her fluffy blanket, but tonight there was no silhouette. A curious frown tugged at my face as I killed the engine. When I entered, the familiar creak of the front door echoed through the hallway, but no cheerful, "Jake, is that you?" greeted me. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you like a too tight scarf. I placed the macarons on the kitchen counter and called out, "Natalie?" Still nothing. My footsteps echoed against the hardwood floors as I moved through the house. The lingering scent of her vanilla candles filled the air, but it felt too strong, almost suffocating. That's when I noticed it, the faint hum of voices upstairs. I froze, my hand resting on the staircase railing. My heart began to pound, not out of fear, but out of something I couldn't quite name, something instinctive, something primal. I climbed the stairs slowly, my military training kicking in as I placed each step deliberately, ensuring it didn't creak. My breath was shallow now, my pulse quickening with every inch I ascended. As I reached the top, I saw that the door to our bedroom was ajar. Light spilled into the hallway, casting eerie shadows that seemed to mock me. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Soft, intimate, and entirely out of place. It wasn't Natalie's usual carefree giggle, the one I adored. No, this was different, lower, warmer, and it was accompanied by a man's voice. A voice I knew all too well. Dan? Dan was a fellow officer and someone I'd considered a close friend. We had shared beers, war stories, and moments of camaraderie that only soldiers could understand. For a moment, my mind refused to connect the dots. Maybe he'd stopped by to check on Natalie. Maybe this was all innocent, but deep down, I already knew. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved closer, my body acting on autopilot. I wanted to turn around, to walk back down the stairs and leave the house entirely, but my legs carried me forward. My hand pushed the door open further, and that's when I saw them. Natalie, wrapped in the silk robe I'd bought her for Christmas last year, was perched on the edge of the bed. Dan was seated next to her, his hand resting on her thigh as they exchanged quiet, intimate whispers. The look on her face wasn't one of surprise or discomfort. It was one of affection. The room spun. My chest tightened as if someone had punched me. Time slowed, and all I could hear was the deafening rush of blood in my ears. I wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't find my voice. Instead, I stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like a spectator in my own life. Natalie noticed me first, her eyes widened, and she pulled away from Dan as if my presence had burned her. Dan turned to look at me, his expression shifting from confusion to panic. "Jake," Natalie stammered, scrambling to her feet. I wasn't expecting you." Dan stood up as well, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Jake, listen, it's not what it looks like. And for it to what? Looks like?" The words came out hoarse, raw. My voice finally found its way through the lump in my throat. "Then by all means, explain. I'm all ear." Neither of them spoke. Natalie looked down at her feet, and Dan glanced toward the window, as if contemplating an escape. The tension in the room was suffocating, wrapping around me like a vice. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to lash out. My training reminded me to stay in control, but the betrayal cut deeper than any enemy's bullet ever could. I turned my gaze to Natalie, who now looked like a stranger to me. "How long?" I asked, my voice low but firm. She hesitated, her lip trembling. It it just happened, Jake. I didn't mean for it to." Dan shifted uncomfortably, and I shot him a glare that made him step back. "You didn't mean for it to?" I repeated, my voice rising. "So what, you tripped and fell into his arms?" "It's not like that," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "I've been so lonely, Jake. You're always gone, and you decided the best way to cope was to crawl into bed with someone I trusted?" My words sliced through the air, each one dripping with venom. Dan finally spoke up. "Jake, man, I'm sorry. "Don't you dare," I snapped, my voice sharp enough to cut steel. "You don't get to apologize, not to me, not for this." The room fell silent again, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. I could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, threatening to consume me. But I knew if I let it, I would become someone I didn't recognize. "I want both of you out of my house," I said finally, my voice cold and steady. "Now." Natalie opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off with a glare. Dan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and bolted, leaving Natalie standing there, tears streaming down her face. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't say another word. I just stood there, staring at the spot where my life had crumbled, wondering how I was supposed to pick up the pieces. The door slammed shut behind Natalie as she left the house, leaving me alone in the deafening silence. My mind raced, replaying the scene over and over like a scratched record that wouldn't stop. The anger simmered just below the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. I wanted to punch something, anything, but instead I stood there, my chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. The realization of what had just happened settled like a lead weight in my stomach. Dan, of all people, it had to be Dan. A man I'd trusted with my life on the battlefield, a man I'd confided in during the darkest moments of my military career. He had been my friend, my brother in arms, and now he was the man who had betrayed me in the most personal, gut-wrenching way imaginable. The betrayal wasn't just Natalie's. It was his, too, and it cut me deeper than I ever thought possible. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, jolting me back to reality. It was a message from Dan. "Jake, I'm sorry, let me explain." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. Explain? What was there to explain? The scene I'd walked in on had been crystal clear. There was no misunderstanding, no room for doubt. I tossed the phone aside, letting it clatter onto the countertop. I couldn't deal with his excuses right now. Or ever, for that matter. I needed air. Grabbing my car keys, I left the house, the door slamming behind me. The cool night breeze hit my face as I stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I climbed into my truck and drove aimlessly, the streets of our suburban neighborhood blurring past me. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get away. Eventually, I found myself at the base, parked outside the barracks where I had spent countless nights with my comrades. The familiar sight of the flagpole standing tall against the moonlit sky brought a bittersweet sense of comfort. This place had always been a refuge for me, a symbol of duty and honor. But tonight, even this sanctuary felt tainted. I sat in my truck, staring at the base until the sound of laughter caught my attention. A group of soldiers stood nearby, sharing jokes and stories as they enjoyed their evening off. For a moment, I considered joining them, seeking the camaraderie that had always been a source of strength for me. But I knew I couldn't face them, not with the weight of my shame and anger hanging over me. As I sat there, the realization hit me. This wasn't just about Natalie and Dan. This was about my life, my choices, and the sacrifices I had made for a marriage that had crumbled under the pressure. I had given everything to my career, to my country, and in doing so, I had neglected the one person who was supposed to stand by my side. Did that excuse her betrayal? No, but it forced me to confront the painful truth that our marriage had been on shaky ground long before tonight. My thoughts were interrupted by another buzz from my phone. This time it was Natalie. "Jake, please, let's talk. I made a mistake, but we can work through this. Don't throw everything away." The audacity of her message made my blood boil. Work through this after what I had seen? My hands trembled as I typed out a reply. "There's nothing to work through. You made your choice, now you'll have to live with it." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The message was harsh, but it was the truth. There was no going back from this. Whatever love or trust had once existed between us had been shattered, and I had no intention of trying to piece it back together. The following day, I went to the base early, needing the structure and routine of military life to ground me. But as I walked into the mess hall for breakfast, I could feel the stares. Word had already spread. Of course it had. In a tight-knit community like this, secrets didn't stay hidden for long. Whispers followed me as I grabbed my tray and found a seat in the corner, away from the curious eyes and hushed conversations. A few minutes later, Captain Reynolds, my commanding officer, approached me. He was a gruff, no-nonsense man, but there was a hint of compassion in his expression as he sat down across from me. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low enough to keep our conversation private. "You okay, son?" I nodded, though the truth was far more complicated. "I'll be fine, sir. Just need some time to process." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Take whatever time you need. But if I can give you one piece of advice, it's this. Don't let this define you. You're a damn good soldier, Jake. Don't let anyone take that away from you." His words hit me harder than I expected. I nodded again, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you, sir." Over the next few days, I threw myself into my work, channeling my anger and pain into something productive. Training exercises, drills, paperwork, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, the memories of that night haunted me. Natalie's face, Dan's voice, the sound of their laughter. It all played on a loop in my head, refusing to let me rest. Then came the base social event, a semi-formal gathering that brought together soldiers and their families for an evening of camaraderie and celebration. I had no intention of attending, but Captain Reynolds insisted, saying it would be good for me to be around my peers. Reluctantly, I agreed. The event was held in the base's main hall, decorated with streamers and banners in patriotic colors. Tables were set up with food and drinks, and a band played softly in the background. As I entered, I immediately felt out of place. The laughter and chatter around me only highlighted the emptiness I felt inside. And then I saw them. Natalie and Dan were standing together near the punch bowl, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. My chest tightened at the sight, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had every right to be here, just as much as they did. I wasn't going to let them drive me away. As the evening went on, I found myself gravitating toward the microphone at the front of the room. Something inside me, call it anger, call it pride, urged me to speak. When the band took a break, I seized the opportunity. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady as I addressed the crowd, I'd like to say a few words." The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at me. I saw Natalie's face pale and Dan shifted uncomfortably. Good. Let them squirm. "I've always believed in the values of loyalty and trust," I began, my gaze sweeping across the room. "Not just on the battlefield, but in every aspect of life. Unfortunately, I've learned that not everyone shares those values." I paused, letting my words sink in. The tension in the room was palpable. "It's easy to talk about honor and integrity," I continued. "But actions speak louder than words. And when someone you trust, someone you'd take a bullet for, betrays you, it forces you to reevaluate everything." I didn't mention Natalie or Dan by name, but I didn't have to. Everyone knew who I was talking about. The weight of my words hung in the air, a silent accusation that left no room for denial. As I stepped away from the microphone, the room erupted in murmurs. I didn't stay to hear what anyone had to say. I had said my piece, and that was enough. I left the hall with my head held high, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The murmurs from the Bay Social event followed me as I walked out of the hall, but I didn't look back. My words had hit their mark, and that was all I cared about. The evening air was crisp, a welcome contrast to the suffocating tension inside. I paused near the flagpole, staring up at the stars, trying to ground myself. I thought the worst was behind me, but as fate would have it, the night was far from over. Footsteps approached behind me, quick and determined. I turned to see Natalie hurrying toward me, her face a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and desperation. Her hands clutched the edges of her dress as if she were bracing herself for battle. I sighed, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. "Jake, what the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice sharp but trembling. I crossed my arms, my expression calm but unyielding. "That, Natalie, was the truth. Something you seem to have forgotten how to deal with." Her face flushed and she glanced around as if worried someone might overhear. "Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? You didn't have to air our personal issues in front of everyone." I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. "Humiliating, that's rich coming from you. You're worried about your reputation, Natalie, but not about the fact that you destroyed our marriage." She flinched at my words, but the defiance in her eyes didn't waver. "It wasn't just me, Jake. You're not blameless in all of this." "Blameless?" My voice rose, my anger bubbling to the surface. "I didn't cheat on you, Natalie. I didn't crawl into bed with someone you trusted. Don't you dare try to shift the blame onto me." Her lip trembled, and for a moment I thought she might cry, but instead she doubled down. "You were never here, Jake. You don't know what it's like to feel so alone all the time, to watch your husband choose his job over you, over and over again. I didn't mean for this to happen, but I was lonely. I needed someone." "And you chose Dan," I said bitterly. "Of all the people in the world, you chose the one person who knew how much I trusted him. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed everything we stood for. Don't you dare justify it as loneliness." Her composure cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was weak, and I'm sorry, but I can't undo what happened. I can only ask for your forgiveness." I stared at her, the woman I had once loved with every fiber of my being. I saw her vulnerability, her regret, but it wasn't enough. The image of her and Dan together was seared into my mind, a constant reminder of what she had done. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer, not now, and maybe not ever. "I can't do this, Natalie," I said finally, my voice steady but cold. "There's nothing left to say." She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the night. I turned to see Dan approaching, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his expression a mix of guilt and determination. I clenched my jaw, every muscle in my body tensing at the sight of him. The last thing I wanted was to deal with him, but there he was, uninvited and unwelcome. "What do you want, Dan?" I asked, my tone sharp. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting between me and Natalie. I wanted to apologize. I know I can't fix this, but I need you to know how sorry I am." "Sorry?" I took a step closer to him, my anger finally boiling over. "You're sorry? You think that fixes anything? You slept with my wife, Dan. You destroyed my trust. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" He looked down at the ground, unable to meet my gaze. "I know I screwed up, Jake. I was stupid and selfish, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But you need to know, it didn't mean anything. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" My voice was cold, laced with venom. "Don't insult me by calling it a mistake. You didn't trip and fall into bed with her, Dan. You made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice. And now you have to live with the consequences." Dan's shoulders slumped, and for a moment he looked like a defeated man. But then he straightened, his expression resolute. "I'll accept whatever punishment you think I deserve, Jake. If you want to report me to the CO, I won't fight it. I'll take full responsibility." I stared at him, my emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted to see him punished, to see him lose everything the way I had. But another part of me knew that no amount of punishment would erase what had happened. It wouldn't bring back my marriage or restore the trust that had been shattered. "I don't need to report you, Dan," I said finally. "Your punishment is living with the knowledge of what you've done. You've lost my friendship, my respect, and your place in this community. That's more than enough." Dan nodded, his face pale. He turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced at Natalie. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice heavy with regret. Natalie didn't respond. She stood frozen, her tears still streaming down her face. As Dan walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure, as if a chapter of my life had finally ended. I turned back to Natalie, who was now looking at me with a mixture of desperation and sorrow. "Jake, please," she whispered. "Don't end this like this. We can still fix it." I shook my head, my resolve firm. "No, Natalie, we can't. Some things can't be undone. This is one of them." Without another word, I walked away, leaving her standing there in the cool night air. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also been necessary. I had faced my demons, spoken my truth, and now I could finally begin to move forward. As I walked back to my truck, the stars above seemed a little brighter, the air a little lighter. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done looking back. It was time to rebuild on my own terms. The following morning, the sunlight pouring through my bedroom window felt different. Less oppressive, more like a beacon of hope than a reminder of everything I'd lost. For the first time in days, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. The events of the past week still weighed heavily on me, but the confrontation the night before had brought a semblance of closure. I had spoken my truth, drawn my line in the sand, and now it was time to figure out how to rebuild my life from the rubble. I got up, showered, and put on my uniform. The familiar feel of the crisp fabric against my skin reminded me of who I was, a soldier, a man of discipline, loyalty, and strength. My life wasn't over, it was just beginning a new chapter, and this time I was determined to take control. As I drove to the base, I felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. The whispers and stares from my fellow soldiers would undoubtedly continue, but I couldn't let them define me. What mattered was how I carried myself moving forward. When I arrived at the base, I went straight to Captain Reynolds' office. He looked up from his paperwork as I knocked on the open door, a small smile playing on his lips. "Jake," he said, gesturing for me to come in. "What can I do for you?" I sat down across from him, my hands resting on my knees. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for your support over the past few days. It's been difficult, but I'm ready to move forward." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad to hear that, son. You've been through the ringer, but you've handled yourself with more grace than most men could muster." I hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I also wanted to talk to you about Dan." His brows furrowed slightly. "What about him?" "I've decided not to file a formal complaint," I said, my voice steady. "What he did was unforgivable, but I don't want to let it consume me. Reporting him would feel like revenge, and that's not who I am. I just want to focus on my work and leave the rest behind." Captain Reynolds studied me for a moment, then nodded. "That's a commendable decision, Jake. It takes a strong man to rise above something like this." "Thank you, sir." We talked for a while longer, discussing upcoming missions and training schedules. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of normalcy creeping back into my life. The base had always been a place of structure and purpose for me, and now it felt like a lifeline. As the week progressed, I threw myself into my duties with renewed focus. I volunteered for extra assignments, eager to stay busy and prove to myself and everyone else that I wasn't going to let the situation break me. My squad mates were supportive in their own ways, offering quiet words of encouragement or simply treating me like nothing had changed. It was exactly what I needed. One evening, after a particularly grueling training exercise, I found myself sitting on the bleachers overlooking the field. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The sight was breathtaking, a reminder of the beauty that still existed in the world despite everything I'd been through. As I sat there, lost in thought, one of my closest friends on the base, Carter, joined me. He was a burly, no-nonsense guy with a heart of gold, a man who always knew how to lighten the mood. "You okay, Jake?" he asked, handing me a bottle of water. I took it with a nod. "Yeah, I think I'm finally starting to be." Carter leaned back, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You know, you've handled this whole mess better than most guys would. Hell, if it were me, I'd probably be locked up for assault right now." I let out a dry laugh. Trust me, I thought about it. But what good would that have done? Dan and Natalie aren't worth ruining my life over. "Damn right they're not," he said firmly. "You've got too much going for you to let those two drag you down." We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Carter's presence was a reminder that, despite everything, I wasn't alone. I had people who cared about me, who had my back no matter what. That weekend, I went back to the house to pack up some of my belongings. Natalie had already moved out, leaving behind a note on the kitchen counter. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to read it. In the end, curiosity won. "Jake, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I never meant to hurt you, and I'll regret what I did for the rest of my life. I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me, even if we can't be together. You deserve happiness, Jake. I'm so sorry I couldn't give it to you. Madeline." I folded the note and placed it back on the counter. Her words stirred something in me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a sense of finality. This was the end of our story, and I was okay with that. She had made her choices, and now I was free to make mine. I spent the rest of the day packing up the things that mattered most to me: family photos, my military memorabilia, a few personal mementos. As I loaded the last box into my truck, I took one final look at the house that had once been our home. It felt strange to say goodbye, but also liberating. This was a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, I focused on myself for the first time in years. I started running again, pushing my body to its limits and finding solace in the rhythm of my footsteps. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during my marriage, and slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again. One evening, as I sat on the porch of my new apartment, sipping a cold beer, I realized how far I'd come. The pain of Natalie's betrayal was still there, but it no longer consumed me. I had survived, I had endured, and now I was stronger for it. The future felt wide open, full of possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I could face it, with my head held high and my heart intact. Life had knocked me down, but I had gotten back up. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself reflecting more deeply on everything that had happened. Betrayal has a way of forcing you to confront not just the actions of others, but also your own choices, your values, and the cracks in your own foundation. Natalie's infidelity and Dan's betrayal had shattered my world, but in the aftermath I began to see things I had been blind to before. Slowly, I started to piece together the lessons I could take from the experience. And sitting on the porch of my new apartment one evening, a notebook and pen in hand, I decided to write down my thoughts. A way to process everything, to make sense of the chaos. The first page was messy, a tangle of anger, hurt, and regret. But as I wrote more, clarity began to emerge. One of the hardest realizations I had to face was my own role in the breakdown of my marriage. No, I wasn't to blame for Natalie's choices. Her decision to cheat was entirely her own. But looking back, I could see how I had contributed to the emotional distance between us. My commitment to my military career had always been absolute, and while I had assumed Natalie understood and accepted that, I hadn't truly listened to her needs. I'd been so focused on providing for her, on fulfilling my duty to the country, that I hadn't noticed the ways she was slipping away. This wasn't about excusing her actions, it was about learning from them. Relationships, I realized, require more than love and good intentions. They require presence, communication, and a willingness to confront issues head-on before they spiral out of control. If I ever found myself in another relationship, I promised myself I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I would strive to be more present, more attentive, and more willing to prioritize my partner in ways I hadn't before. Another unexpected lesson came from examining my friendship with Dan. Trust is a cornerstone of any relationship, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, or a professional bond. For years, I had trusted Dan implicitly, believing that our shared experiences in the military made him as loyal and honorable as I tried to be. His betrayal shook that belief to its core, forcing me to question my ability to judge people's character. But as painful as it was, the experience also taught me to reevaluate what trust truly means. Trust isn't just about believing someone won't betray you. It's about understanding their values, their motivations, and their weaknesses. I had assumed Dan shared my sense of loyalty, but I hadn't paid enough attention to the subtle ways he had shown otherwise. The casual comments he'd made about taking shortcuts, the stories he'd told that hinted at a willingness to bend the rules. I had brushed those aside, telling myself they didn't matter. Now I realized they had been warning signs all along. Going forward, I vowed to be more discerning about who I let into my inner circle. Trust would have to be earned, not given freely. And while I didn't want to become cynical or closed off, I knew I had to be more cautious. Not everyone deserved a seat at my table, and that was okay. In the midst of all this introspection, I found myself thinking a lot about the concept of forgiveness. For a long time, I thought forgiveness meant letting go of anger and moving on as if nothing had happened. But that wasn't true. Forgiveness, I learned, didn't have to mean reconciliation. It didn't have to mean forgetting or excusing what someone had done. It simply meant releasing the hold their actions had on my life. Forgiving Natalie and Dan didn't come easily, and it didn't happen all at once. Some days, the anger and hurt still bubbled up, threatening to pull me back into the darkness. But with time, I began to see forgiveness not as a gift to them, but as a gift to myself. By letting go of the resentment, I freed myself from the burden of carrying it around. I wasn't excusing their behavior. I was choosing not to let it define me. Forgiveness, I realized, was an act of strength, not weakness. It was about reclaiming my power and refusing to let anyone else dictate the course of my life. Through it all, one thing became abundantly clear. Resilience wasn't something I was born with, it was something I built, brick by brick, through every challenge I faced. The military had taught me discipline and perseverance, but this experience had taught me emotional resilience. It had shown me that even when life knocks you down, even when the people you trust most let you down, you have the strength to get back up and keep moving forward. I began to notice the small victories in my daily life, finishing a grueling workout, reconnecting with an old friend, completing a challenging assignment at work. These moments, as small as they seemed, were proof that I was healing. They reminded me that life didn't end with Natalie's betrayal. It was still unfolding, one day at a time. I also started to redefine what happiness meant to me. For so long, I had equated happiness with stability, having a steady job, a loving wife, a comfortable home. But now I saw that happiness was about more than external factors. It was about finding peace within myself, embracing the present moment, and pursuing the things that brought me joy. Whether it was hiking in the nearby mountains, volunteering at the base's mentorship program, or simply sitting on my porch with a cold beer and a good book, I found solace in the simplicity of life. Perhaps the most surprising realization of all was how much stronger I felt on the other side of this experience. I had walked through fire, endured betrayal, and faced the pain head-on, and I had come out the other side not as a broken man, but as a better one. The scars were still there, but they were a testament to my resilience, a reminder of what I was capable of overcoming. Looking back, I didn't regret the choices I had made, even the ones that led to heartbreak. They had shaped me into the person I was today, a man who knew his worth, who valued loyalty and integrity, and who was unafraid to face life's challenges head-on. As I closed my notebook and set down my pen, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to face it with an open heart and a clear mind. Life would continue, and so would I. And for the first time in a long time, that thought didn't scare me, it excited me. The morning air was crisp as I laced up my running shoes, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. It had become my ritual, a way to clear my mind, to remind myself that every step forward was a step toward healing. Today felt different, though. There was a certain lightness in my chest, a feeling of hope that I hadn't experienced in months. As I started down the trail, the familiar rhythm of my feet hitting the ground was both comforting and empowering. This wasn't just a run, it was a metaphor for everything I had endured. Each mile represented the distance I had put between myself and the pain of the past. Each breath reminded me that I was still here, still fighting, still moving forward. When I reached the top of the hill that overlooked the base, I paused to take it all in. The flag fluttered in the wind, a symbol of resilience and strength. The view was breathtaking, the kind that made you stop and reflect on the beauty of life, even in its messiest moments. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. This was my fresh start. As I stood there, I thought about how far I had come. The betrayal that had once consumed me no longer felt like the defining moment of my life. It was a chapter, an important one, yes, but not the whole story. I was more than the man who had been cheated on. I was a soldier, a friend, a man with dreams and ambitions that extended far beyond the pain of my past. The lessons I had learned were hard-earned but invaluable. I had discovered the strength of my own character, the importance of setting boundaries, and the power of forgiveness. Not for others, but for myself. I had learned to embrace the uncertainty of life, to find joy in the simple moments, and to trust that every ending was also a beginning. As I made my way back down the trail, I couldn't help but smile. There was still so much ahead of me, so many possibilities, so many opportunities to grow and thrive. I wasn't sure where life would take me next, but I was ready to find out. That night, as I sat on my porch with a cold beer in hand, watching the stars twinkle in the vast expanse above, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that settles deep in your soul, reminding you that you're exactly where you're meant to be. Life had knocked me down, but I had risen stronger, and for the first time I wasn't looking back, I was looking ahead, ready to face whatever came next. This was my story, and I was determined to write the rest of it on my own terms.